This story challenged me. The level of brutality involved in the sadistic killing was far beyond what I imagined could be possible by two primary school children. In order to tell this story, I'll have to do it in 4 different parts. Act 1, the murderers pre-murder. Act 2, the day of the murder. Act 3, catching the James Bulger killers. Act 4, the murderers post-murder. Act 1. In order to understand the almost inconceivability of the crime itself and 2 suspects below the age at which law judges young people as morally capable, the media and the public needed surrogate criminals to bear the blame, to be the object of their sense of outrage and desire for retribution. But was it the parents' fault? Thompson and Venables grew up in circumstances that had both striking similarities and profound differences. Both boys had parents who had separated. Each had difficulties with attendance, learning, and behaviour at school. They skipped school, they shoplifted, they were violent. All of these pieces in a pattern that make up a pair of empty, broken young lives. Before the trial in November 1993, the press was searching for anything that might determine whether or not these 2 10-year-old boys were indeed evil or the product of evil. Neighbours told of pigeons having their heads shot off with an air gun, of rabbits being tied to railway lines. There were tales of charity collection boxes being stolen and of children being assaulted in the classroom. This picture of neglect slowly started emerging. A picture that focused on the pair's bad parents, with the Daily Mail pronouncing, quote, "John Venables, perhaps inevitably, is a classic product of a broken home. Anne Thompson was portrayed as an incompetent alcoholic, while Susan Venables was painted as a loose woman whose neighbours, quote, noted a procession of men friends for Miss Venables." A narrative emerged of 2 childhoods influenced not merely by the flaws of their parents or the absence of a father, but by the environment in which these boys lived, a world of social and economic deprivation, of trashy television and cultural poverty, inadequate social services, failed schooling, and general confusion. It was a place that left a moral vacuum for 2 children who would go on to kill and leave the unanswered question: why did they do it? But can such guilt be so neatly apportioned? There are many families where the parents are struggling to cope, where the children have behavioural problems. The Venables and Thompson families were at very different places on the spectrum of dysfunctional families. If the chain of casualty between parental failings and juvenile homicide was so straightforwardly simple, then how many families should be regarded as pathological potential producers of more child killers? Act 2. The day of the murder. The day of 12th of February 1993 began quite normally, with James's mum taking her son along with her to the New Strand shopping centre in Bootle, England. Denise went to accompany a friend and decided to take James along with her, something she'll regret for the rest of her life. Unbeknownst to them, Robert Thompson and John Venables skipped school that same day and made their way to the same shopping centre. Throughout the day, the boys were seen running through the shopping centre, stealing various items including sweets, a troll doll, some batteries, and a can of blue paint, some of which were later found at the murder scene. The boys actually attempted to abduct another young boy. They spotted the boy with his mother, and once her back was turned, they beckoned to him. This little boy eventually followed Venables and Thompson outside. Luckily, the child's mother was able to find him outside before any harm could be done. However, it is argued that the boys had hoped to push the child into traffic. Mere luck had saved the boy and sealed James Bulger's terrible fate. Soon after the aborted abduction, Venables and Thompson were loitering around a snack kiosk, hoping to steal candy when they noticed James Bulger by the door of a nearby butcher's shop. Bulger's mother, Denise, let go of his hand momentarily to pay for the shopping. This was the last time she'd see her son alive. With Denise distracted, Venables and Thompson approached the toddler, took him by the hand and led him out of the shopping centre. The moment was caught on CCTV at 3:42 p.m. Meanwhile, after Venables, Thompson and Bulger had left the mall, the toddler began crying out for his mother. The older boys ignored him and continued down to a secluded area near a canal around half a kilometre from the New Strand shopping centre. At the canal, they dropped Bulger on his head, suffering injuries to his face, and was left on the ground crying hysterically. During a 4-kilometre walk across Liverpool, the boys were seen by 38 people. Some witnesses remembered seeing Bulger laughing, while others remembered seeing him resisting and even screaming for his mother. One person even saw Thompson kick Bulger in the ribs for resisting. Still, no one did anything. Soon after, a woman saw Thompson punch Bulger and violently shake him, but she pulled her curtains and blocked out the scene. Another bystander provided a glimmer of hope, however fleeting, for James Bulger. With evening approaching, an elderly woman saw Bulger crying, noticed his injuries and approached the trio to inquire what was wrong. But the two 10-year-olds said, "We just found him at the bottom of the hill." Apparently satisfied with the explanation, the woman simply told the two boys to take the toddler down to the nearby Walton Lane police station. She called out to them once more as they walked away, but they did not look back. She was concerned, but another woman standing by said she'd heard James laughing moments ago, and so both assumed nothing was wrong. Later that night, one of the women saw the news that Bulger was missing. She phoned the police and expressed regret for not doing something. Not long after the elderly woman sent the boys on their way, Bulger was almost rescued yet again. A woman concerned for the toddler told Venables and Thompson that she would take the child to the police station herself. But when she asked another woman nearby to look after her daughter while she did so, that woman refused because her dog did not like children, and so Bulger slipped away from safety once again. Thompson, Venables and Bulger arrived at the railway. The boys hesitated, perhaps reconsidering what they were about to do, and did briefly turn away from the embankment. But then John Venables and Robert Thompson turned back toward the privacy of the deserted railway. This is when they began torturing him. Venables and Thompson had brought blue paint stolen from the shopping mall and splashed it in Bulger's left eye. Then they kicked him and pummeled him with bricks and stones. They also stuffed batteries into his mouth. The two boys then hit Bulger over the head with a 10-kilogram iron bar, causing 10 skull fractures. In total, Bulger sustained 42 injuries to his face, head and body. With so many injuries sustained, authorities concluded that there was no way to tell which injury was the one that killed Bulger. After killing the child, Venables and Thompson placed Bulger's dead body across the train tracks in hope that a train would hit him and make his death appear to be an accident. They then abandoned the scene. Soon afterwards, a train entered the train yard and severed the toddler in two. Act 3. Catching the James Bulger killers. The next day, police searched the canal where the boys had been earlier in the afternoon because an eyewitness had reported seeing Bulger there. Other searches were conducted elsewhere, all leading to nothing. With little to go on, Bulger's parents were suspects initially, but when the police eventually saw the CCTV footage from the shopping mall, they could not believe their eyes. Despite the fuzzy footage, it was two small boys that could be seen leading James Bulger to the exit. Once those CCTV images were released to the media, the story went nationwide and his search for Bulger intensified. When Bulger's father, Ralph, saw that it was just two boys with his son who had left the moor, he was relieved. I looked at Denise and smiled with relief. "He's gonna be alright, Denise," I said. "He's with two young kids. He's gonna be alright." The search ended 2 days after the disappearance when 4 children discovered Bulger's body on the railway track, just 200 metres from the nearest police station. All of the instruments used in the attack were found strewn around the area. The iron bar, stones and bricks all covered in the boy's blood. The stolen tin of blue paint was found nearby. With some evidence in hand, and the knowledge that James Bulger killers were likely 2 children, the police checked nearby schools' absentee lists for the day of the disappearance. This caused various children to be identified as potential killers, with some parents even reporting their own kids. But it was ultimately an anonymous phone call to the police that implicated John Venables and Robert Thompson as the James Bulger killers. The caller told the police that Venables and Thompson were both absent from school on Friday and that they themselves had seen blue paint on the sleeves of Venables' jacket. The police then visited both children's homes and discovered blood on Thompson's shoes and blue paint on Venables' jacket. Both boys were then arrested as the James Bulger killers. But during separate police interviews, John Venables and Robert Thompson turned on each other. Over the course of the interviews lasting several days, Venables eventually confessed. Thompson, on the other hand, was not such an easy interview. "He totally denied everything," said Detective Sergeant Phil Roberts. "But in the end, he shot himself in the foot by giving me a detailed account of what James Bulger was wearing." Nevertheless, throughout the whole process, Thompson remained chillingly unfazed, earning him the nickname, "the boy who did not cry." Act 4. The murderers post-murder. Venables and Thompson were both charged, but because they were minors, their identities were withheld from the public. 9 months later, the trial began. Outside the courthouse, people called for the blood of the James Bulger killers. "Kill the bastards," people yelled. "A life for a life." Unanimous disgust only intensified when witnesses and the media noted Thompson's cold, seemingly remorseless behaviour at the trial compared with Venables' hysterical outbursts. Therefore, it was widely assumed that Thompson was the instigator, even though psychiatrists and authorities have never been able to reach a conclusion on the boys' motives. Moreover, court-appointed psychiatrists determined that the 2 boys knew right from wrong and weren't sociopaths, but were nevertheless able to uncover any concrete motives for the James Bulger murder. Something no professional has been able to confidently determine even in the years since. Motive aside, both John Venables and Robert Thompson were convinced of the James Bulger murder, making them the youngest to be convicted of the crime in Britain in 250 years. As the jury foreman read the verdict, Venables and Thompson were sitting in an adult court dock that had been altered so that the boys could see over it. Venables and Thompson were then sentenced to serve at Her Majesty's pleasure, as is standard protocol for juvenile offenders convicted of murder or manslaughter. This indefinite sentence has no maximum, but does have a minimum to be determined on a case-by-case basis. In this case, it was just 8 years, at which time the boys would be 18. After that point, the James Bulger killers were to be assessed and, if they weren't deemed to be a danger to society, released. By all accounts, Venables and Thompson showed no violent or aberrant behaviour in prison, but instead served their time for the James Bulger murder quietly and without incident. So when the 8 years were up in 2001, both boys were released. Upon their release, John Venables and Robert Thompson were given new identities and granted legal anonymity for life due to the public fury that surrounded their trial and the danger of citizens hunting down the infamous James Bulger killers in order to take vengeance. To date, no significant attempts at vengeance have been made. James Bulger's mother, Denise, was able to locate Robert Thompson in 2004, but was paralysed with hatred and could not confront him. Today, while Thompson is believed to be assimilating back into society and living a quiet life, the same cannot be said of Venables. In 2010, he was imprisoned for downloading images depicting various kinds of sexual abuse being inflicted upon male toddlers. He became eligible for parole in 2013, at which time Ralph Bulger told the parole board that he couldn't forgive his son's killers and that Venables should not be released. "Sometimes you feel like you're having a heart attack," he said at the time. "It's just a big knot in your chest, and that's been there since day one." Nevertheless, Venables was released. But in November 2017, Venables was again imprisoned when more child abuse images and a pedophile manual that provided instructions on having sex with kids were discovered on his computer. John Venables was sentenced to 3 years and 4 months in prison, not far from half the amount of time he served for joining Robert Thompson in perpetuating the murder of James Bulger a quarter of a century before. Denise set up the James Bulger Memorial Trust for James in 2010. The charity offers support to children and their families who have suffered a bereavement, been a victim of race, or hate crime or bullying, and those who have done a good deed within their school or community.
Yeah, we was, but we never saw any kids there. We never robbed any kids.
So you were in Brutality-Strand?
Was you in Brutality-Strand?
Yeah, but we never got a kid, Mum. We never got a
Mrs. Venables, would you... I must ask you not to get angry with it.
I never got the boy. I never killed him, Mum.
And then he admits, yeah, being with James and then taking James.
So we walked up to him and we were walking around with him and I took his hand.
And whose idea was it to walk towards him?
Mine.
Was it?
Then it was Robert's idea to kill him.
That's when I felt sort of, boom, you get a bit of a thud thinking, oh my God, we have got the right kids.
John Venables was frightened of upsetting his mother. Susan just, said to him, look, we'll always love you, we'll always support you. You really need to tell the truth. And so that was the breakthrough then that led to the next interview.
A short while ago, as is detailed on your custody record out there, you had a conversation with your mum and you then requested that myself come into the room. Is that right? Yeah. And what was it you told us?
That I killed James.